Listen up, folks, prepare to be blown away by my jaw-dropping story. I'm just a regular 17-year-old, right? Well, brace yourselves because life took an unexpected turn. Fresh off my high school graduation, I'm proud to announce that I've been a straight-A student since forever. Hold on to your seats because here's the real shocker. For almost 2 years now, I've been sharing a roof with none other than my 37-year-old single mom. Oh, and did I mention that she's the genius head chef at our city's finest Italian eatery? Unbelievable, right? When I was just 10, my parents split up and went their separate ways. They used to share custody of me, but then my dad got diagnosed with brain cancer. He used to run his family's trucking business, but he had to give it all up when he got sick. Before, I used to switch homes every week, but now I'm stuck living with my mom all the time because of my dad's terrible condition. Despite visiting my dad frequently, I couldn't help but feel a constant longing to live with him again. The truth is, I've always been much more attached to my dad than my mom, who has always been extremely uptight, making it impossible for us to connect. Our relationship was constantly filled with conflict, first between my mom and dad, and after their divorce, it shifted to me. She had her good moments too, though, so I didn't mind staying with her. And after my dad's diagnosis, I had no choice but to stay with her, so I made my peace with it. My mother and I, in the recent past, have not been on good terms, mostly because of her relationship with her new husband and how he treats me. My mother got married for a second time just 8 months ago to Mark, 32 years old. She'd been with Mark for a little over 1 year, and I only found out about it when he proposed because she'd kept their relationship well under wraps. It was the significant age gap between the two, and my dad had just been diagnosed at the time, which also didn't help, so she just kept it a secret. It was only after he popped the question that she revealed their relationship. I was forced to accept it despite my deep dislike and mistrust towards Mark. He always seemed fake and insincere, even when he pretended to be kind. Something was just not right about him, if you catch my drift. Of course, I couldn't tell my mother that because then she'd think I was trying to discourage her from getting married on purpose or some other ridiculous thing. I put up with Mark, but I didn't allow him to be my friend, and I realized I was right about him just 3 months after the wedding. He'd moved in with us after the wedding, and since he was a high school football coach, he'd be home a lot earlier than my mother. We'd end up spending a lot of time at home by ourselves before my mother came home, and surprisingly, he never tried to even speak to me when we were on our own. But as soon as my mother would be home, he'd turn on the charm and try to act like we were best buddies. Anyone in their right mind would be able to see right through his little act, and to my horror, I realized I wasn't alone. I decided to grab a bite from the kitchen when suddenly I heard a bone-chilling sound coming from my mother's room. It sent shivers down my spine, knowing that only my family knew about the hidden safe she kept beneath her bed, which she guarded with her life. I always kept the spare keys close by, but I had never given them to Mark, so I realized that he must have stolen my mom's set-to locker contained all of my mother's wedding jewelry back from when she got married to my dad and a lot of other really expensive jewelry too. She also kept some spare bundles of cash stashed away in the locker for emergencies. She didn't trust bank lockers and preferred to keep these valuables close to herself because she felt it was considerably safer. It was a whole thing. I watched Mark take out an entire bundle of cash and put it in his pocket. I was too shocked to even move and stayed rooted to my spot. So when Mark turned around, he spotted me standing right outside the bedroom. He looked irritated for a second and then gave me a big smile, walked towards me, and then put his arm around my shoulder while walking me to the living room couch. There he claimed that my mother urgently requested him to fetch a load of money for an emergency situation, and he was on his way to deliver it. He insisted that this was completely ordinary, and it wasn't necessary for me to discuss it with my mother. Determined, I planned to confront my mother about it as soon as she returned home that day. But as soon as I started the conversation, she told me she didn't want to hear it. I just sat her down in private and told her that I had something to talk to her about with regards to Mark. And as soon as I said that, she shot me down instantly. She told me that she'd seen this coming and knew this was going to happen at some point or the other. My mom thought I was going to tell her the same old, "Mark is not the right guy for you." And for some reason, she believed that I was going to try and ask her to patch things up between her and my dad. I don't know why she assumed that because I'd never made it seem like I thought she and my dad were good together or whatever. I was so relieved when they finally split because it was way better than them staying together and torturing me with their constant fights every single day. I tried to talk to her about it, but she totally freaked out and threatened to punish me if I dared speak a single bad word about Mark. That pissed me off, so I decided that she could suffer for all I care since she was clearly too taken by Mark's surface-level attractiveness to notice what a loser he was. If she wanted to believe a lie and stay delusional, then I wasn't going to stop her, especially after she'd insulted me like that. I didn't bring up the incident with Mark after that and waited for my mother to catch on herself, which she unfortunately never did. Months passed like this, and I grew more and more distant from my mother because she was obsessed with her husband, and it was just gross simply because it was Mark of all people. Then, about a week ago, my mother decided to sit me down and talk to me about something very important. It was the weekend, and Mark was out with his friends, so it was just my mother and I. My first thought was that there was bad news about my dad, but she told me that wasn't it and started to beat around the bush about irrelevant things. I didn't know what she was trying to get at, and so after some time, I got fed up with her and told her to cut to the chase already. She suddenly exclaimed that she wanted me gone from the house immediately because Mark, her husband, told her that he felt uncomfortable around me and that I made him feel unsafe and unwanted. I knew my mother really liked Mark, but I never expected this. It made no sense for her to kick me out just because her insecure husband felt uneasy about nothing. I knew that Mark was afraid of me telling my mother about the locker incident, and also just generally scared that someday I'd force my mother to take her rose-colored glasses off and see him for what he truly was. But he didn't have any reason to worry because after the way my mother had spoken to me when I tried to tell her the truth, she had made sure that I didn't say anything to her at all beyond that point. In any case, I was so bloody done with my mom that I didn't even bother to argue with her and just said, "Okay," then got up and started packing. My head was pounding with anger while I was packing, and I honestly wanted to wait for Mark to come home so I could punch him in the face. But then I found my mother's spare keys to the locker and had a better idea. I snuck into my mom's room while she was watching television in the living room, grabbed her bag, took out the keys, and then took them away. I also left a note in her purse saying that if she wanted to know where her original keys were, she could talk to Mark about it to make sure that he wouldn't get away with this scot-free. I packed up my stuff, including clothes, books, and other things I needed. When I said goodbye to my mom in the living room, she was shocked. She didn't think I was going to leave that day and had been sitting there watching TV instead of helping me. In spite of the initial shock, she got over it super quickly and hugged me goodbye. There was not a single tear in her eye, and neither did she seem unhappy about the situation. It was painfully evident that none of this seemed problematic to her at all. I left the house and boarded the bus that took me to my dad's house, which happened to be far away from my mother's place. It was about 2,000 miles away in the suburbs, which is part of the reason why I used to live with my mom. My dad was still undergoing treatment and had to be in and out of the hospital frequently. He lived with his brother who took care of him, and whenever I visit him, which is almost every week, I try to keep the conversation light and positive so he wouldn't worry too much about me. I missed him, but I also cared about him and his wife way too much, so I had never said anything about Mark or my mother with him. Whenever he'd asked me how I was doing at home and how my mother and her new husband were treating me, I lied to him and told him that it was all good. But now I had no choice but to reveal the horrifying truth to him, and I did so without hesitation because it was crucial for him to be aware of it. I disclosed every detail, including the events of that fateful day. My dad became so furious that his ears actually turned red, a sight I had never witnessed before. I was a little worried that he'd fly off the handle, and that wouldn't be good for his health, but he managed to contain himself. Just to pacify him, I also told him how I took the keys and the note that I left, which would ensure that my mother found out about Mark's thieving. That seemed to make him feel slightly better, and he told me that I was clever for doing that. My dad and my uncle then told me not to worry about anything and said that they were perfectly fine with taking care of me. The one and only reason they'd even agreed to let me move in with my mom full-time was that they thought it would be easier and more convenient for me. But if this was the case, then they'd happily take me back. I was also much happier with my dad and my uncle, so I didn't really mind that my mother had sent me away on the first day. I didn't hear back from my mother at all, and neither did my father. But the very next day, my mother sent me a video of her sobbing and apologizing to me for whatever had happened. She was begging me to come back because she'd realized that she'd screwed up by stealing from the woman who'd put her heart and soul into the relationship. My mother texted me, saying that this video was supposed to be proof that Mark did feel guilty about whatever he had done and for forcing her to kick me out. My plan had worked, and when she'd noticed the missing keys and the note, she'd confronted Mark about it, and he'd been left with no choice but to come out with the truth. I took pleasure in watching him cry, but then my mom texted me, saying she'd only forgive him if I returned. It went from being enjoyable to downright frustrating. She should have realized I'd rather endure hell than go back to that place where I was constantly ignored. I was either invisible or being treated like a burden, and neither of those two choices seemed like something anyone would want to pick from. And for my mother to even leave the choice to me was ridiculous, because it should have been her choice to end that marriage and apologize to me for what she did. If Mark was the bad guy here, so was she, and probably even worse than Mark because at least he wasn't related to me. She, being my mom, had kicked me out for another man, and that was unforgivable. It wasn't just Mark who should have been apologizing, but she should also have been regretting what she put me through. Instead, she was treating this as some sort of sick game. I didn't understand why she left the fate of her marriage up to me to be decided, but since she had left it up to me, I chose to say that I wasn't going to come back, and she had to leave Mark. In response to that, she sent me another video of a much calmer, but still upset-looking Mark, saying that he understood where I was coming from, but he loved my mom and just needed one last opportunity to prove it to us. He sounded like he was on the verge of tears and was going to stop begging me on his knees any moment now, and that made me feel bad. But I still wasn't convinced, so I said that my decision was final. To that, my mother finally replied, saying that I was being way too harsh on both of them. Two supposedly mature adults are desperately begging for my forgiveness, going so far as to endanger their own happiness in marriage just to please me. Yet I callously disregard their efforts and instead strive to distance myself even more. I couldn't bring myself to respond to her message, opting instead to completely ignore it. Astonishingly, she has persistently bombarded me with messages over the past 6 days, desperately attempting to win me back, and every single day, there's a video message from her and Mark where they apologize to me for treating me badly. She's told me repeatedly in the videos unless I agree to come back, she'll file for divorce to prove to me that she's serious. Yesterday, she even told me that she'd been speaking to a lawyer and sent me texts to prove that it was true. Mark also looked upset in the video message they sent and begged me to forgive him because he couldn't afford to lose a woman like my mother. I know that I'm destroying their marriage, but to be honest, I feel like whatever my mother is doing is really sick, and I can't bring myself to dignify it with a response of any kind. Not only is she torturing her own husband, but she's also putting me through something very unnecessary because I don't think I'm the one who needs to make a call about what to do in a situation like this. She shouldn't be putting the responsibility of deciding with regards to her marriage on my shoulders in the first place. Does that make me look like the reason their marriage had to end was that her daughter wasn't happy about her marriage? Everyone knows it's not true. I don't want to feel bad, but she's cornering me so I can't escape. But seriously, Mark is a terrible person, and it's insane that he's letting himself be treated like this just because my mother's richer than him. It's dehumanizing, and I can't believe he's just letting her do this to him every day. I haven't told my dad about it because I don't want him to worry about me. And I know if I tell him, he'll definitely intervene, and that'll be another dramatic showdown that I don't want him to take on. I feel terrible, but I don't know what to do here. It's a lot for refusing to decide whether my mother should divorce her failing husband. Update 1. Hey guys, so I read the comments on my original post, and the general consensus was that I should tell my dad about what I was going through instead of trying to deal with all my problems myself. I guess it's true because I do tend to take it all on myself instead of speaking up and asking for help when I need help. I feel bad telling my dad because I think it might be bothersome for him since he has so much on his plate already. I mean, he's a literal cancer patient, so it's not easy for me to go to him with my problems the way I used to before his diagnosis. I think if I just tried to talk to him, then maybe I wouldn't have had to go through so much because he wouldn't have allowed it at all. Like this time, I finally told my dad all about my mother and her sick techniques, and he called her up and tore into her. She tried to tell my dad that this was none of his business, but he wasn't having it and told her that he'd be filing for full custody and that he'd make sure she doesn't ever get to see me after this. She pretended to protest, but deep down, my dad and I realized she was completely indifferent towards me. Her main concern was how she would be perceived by others when they discovered she lost custody of her only child because she prioritized her husband over her own flesh and blood. That's why she relentlessly battled my dad for me, not out of love but for her selfish reputation. If she loved me, she would have been a better mother, and that was something she'd never even tried to be. Now it was just too late. After the phone call with my mom, my dad explained to me the same things that people in the comments had told me, that I was his daughter, and that I didn't need to think twice before coming to him with a problem because as a father, he could never think of me as a burden. My well-being was his responsibility, and his cancer wasn't going to prevent him from giving me the best life and solving my problems whenever he needed to step in. And I needed to remember that. I won't lie, I teared up at that point because it just reminded me that even though he was a lot weaker than I remembered, he was still my strong dad underneath. I broke down completely when I realized that I actually felt safe and loved again after a really long time, all thanks to my mom and Mark. I'd completely forgotten what it was like to feel that way, but then my dad reminded me that no matter what, he would always protect me, even if it meant facing the worst diseases in the world. It sounds ridiculously sentimental, but I'm genuinely thrilled that it's the reality for me. Update 2. My dad has filed for full custody of me, and my mom isn't going to get any visitation rights either. It doesn't really matter since I'm just 1 year away from being a legal adult anyway. But my dad said that he just doesn't trust my mother anymore because her head has obviously been turned by Mark's presence in her life. Recently, she texted me to tell me that I disappointed her by dragging my dad into this, even though I knew he was sick, and called me a selfish and manipulative brat. She also added that she was really happy now that she hadn't actually divorced Mark over what I said. I was accused of trying to drive a wedge between them because that's the kind of petty person I was, but to raise my mom to be a strong, successful woman. Now she's almost in her 40s, so they can't be held responsible for whatever she's up to now. Unfortunately, my mother failed on all fronts as a wife, as a mother, and even as a daughter. Update 3. Hey guys, today was a seriously mind-blowing day. My mom officially cut all ties with me, and now I'm totally free from her. I went with my dad to witness this crazy moment, and guess what? I bumped into her again, maybe for the last time ever. It's like I don't even exist to her anymore. I'm so shocked and confused. I don't even know what to feel. Like, I'm sad, but I'm also relieved, I guess. I don't know, I just have mixed feelings about all of this. Mark wasn't there, which was no big surprise because that thief probably didn't have the spine to face me after whatever happened. It was only my mother's actions that really hurt me. Anyway, he can go to hell because he's very unimpressive and in my life. My dad and uncle treated me to dinner today, trying to lift my spirits. It worked a bit, but guess what? Just 2 days ago, we found out that my dad's actually improving. Can you believe it? He might actually beat cancer. Please, please pray for him because I can't bear the thought of losing my only parent whom I love so much. I just can't. My uncle's great, but he's not my dad, and nobody will ever be like him ever. I don't know how much time I have with him, but I just hope that whatever time we have together is only good times and nothing else. Nevertheless, I hope you guys keep us in your prayers, and thank you to all of you who responded.